Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air for the 18th week of 2015, a week in which the Obama administration's drone assassination program, the most extensive global terrorism campaign the world has yet seen, which has come home to overwhelming police killings in the U.S., far beyond what happens in other countries, has led to the U.S. military in the streets of Baltimore. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. AWARE is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. AWARE is an association of residents of Champaign-Urbana who oppose the U.S. government's war-making. Most Americans are unaware that President Obama is making war in 8 countries around the world: Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and the Philippines, in violation of the UN Charter, which forbids the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state without the authorization of the UN Security Council. Most Americans are unaware that he is sending American death squads, we call them special operation forces, into more than 100 countries around the world, where their operations include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. Most Americans are unaware that he's conducting the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, a secret series of murders by drone, which have already killed thousands, including American citizens and hundreds of children. And that they are also unaware that he is recklessly provoking war with Russia and Ukraine, where a U.S. proxy government has already killed thousands, more than U.S. client Israel killed in Gaza last year. Why has Obama, who was elected in part because of Americans' opposition to George Bush's dumb wars, outdone Bush in belligerence and expanded his wars in Europe, Asia, and Africa? The wars are not in the interest of the vast majority of Americans, who forego government services and are taxed to pay for them, to the point that the U.S. is the most unequal developed country in the world, and is becoming more so at an increasing rate. But the wars are in the interest of very few Americans, the very rich, the 1%, who profit enormously from the U.S. control of the world economy. In the years after the Second World War, from which the U.S. emerged as the only generally undamaged major country, George Kennan, the leading U.S. foreign policy planner, wrote that to maintain the, quote, position of disparity, close quote, that separated America's enormous wealth from the poverty of the rest of the world, we should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization, and must deal in straight power concepts, close quote. This was the conscious plan of the American State Department at the end of the Second World War. There are today 2 interconnected areas for the application of those power concepts: the Mideast and Eurasia. And they were connected by world energy supplies, oil and gas, which the U.S. government intended to control. About 75% of the world's people live in Eurasia, which also has 3/4 of the world's known energy resources. And U.S. control over world energy gives it leverage over our economic rivals from Germany to China. Control of, and not just access to, Mideast gas and oil was what the U.S. demanded, and our government has been willing to kill a lot of people to ensure it. Wars conducted by U.S. presidents have killed, wounded, and made homeless well over 20 million human beings in the last 50 years, mostly civilians. Obama was elected on a platform of hope and change, but he's brought little hope and almost no change to U.S. war policy, except perhaps to lie more successfully about what he was doing than George Bush ever did. His policies are not different, but even more murderous. It's no wonder that the U.S. is hated around the world in the era of the Bush-Obama wars. Champaign-Urbana Aware recommends that you contact the President and our representatives in Congress and tell them to stop killing people around the world and to bring all U.S. troops home. The Aware web page and Facebook page have email addresses and phone numbers for President Obama, Senator Dick Durbin, Senator Mark Kirk, and Representative Rodney Davis. The Obama administration are today committing murder around the world, but pretending that they aren't in order to mislead the only enemy they really fear, the American people, who drove 2 presidents from office during the Vietnam War. And the government is helped in this deception by a compliant, big business-run media, so Americans know far less about what's going on than citizens of other countries. Tonight we'll try to give a better account with commentaries by Karen Aram and Ron Szoke, and a special guest, my old friend Timothy Kendall of Virginia, who made the sacrifice of going to prison for years for his opposition to the Vietnam War. He's now an information technologist and music director in town to do a program for WILL, and we're happy to have him with us today. We'll start with Ron Szoke. Ron chooses his own titles, as you know. Happy Ed Balls Day, right?
Yes. Well, I can't assume, I suppose, that everyone knows who Ed Balls is. Yeah. He is the shadow chancellor of the Exchequer in the Labour Party in England, and there's a political campaign going on there right now. 4 years ago today, he tweeted his name, and everybody started retweeting it. It's been done thousands of times now, and there are signs all over England, I understand. There are greeting cards in the racks everywhere, and it's become a kind of Monty Python-esque holiday or something in England. People are already complaining that it's become so commercialized that the true spirit of Ed Balls Day is being lost. And so I don't know what will happen there. But okay, I wanted to return to my theme of last week briefly on austerity. We see it being played out, enacted in Quebec, as we mentioned then, as more and more social service and educational subsidies are being withdrawn from the students in Quebec. And of course, it's coming to a head now in Greece, where Greece is asking for relief from its debt payments to the European Union and International Monetary Fund or whoever else is involved in these loans to Greece. And the conflict there is becoming more and more serious. These loaners are demanding reforms from Greece, which is a code word for taking more money from the middle and working class and paying off the big bondholders, the big investors. So it's another chapter in the massive transfer of wealth that's going on from the middle and working classes to the very rich, not only in Greece, of course, but in here, in the USA. And it has led to the enrichment of the 1% in this country, this kind of phenomenon, since the mid-1970s. So we're getting another version of it now from Governor Rauner in the state of Illinois. A lot of social services and human services are being zeroed out in the budget, and it's going to cause more and more suffering for people, not only in Greece and problems for people in Quebec, but right here at home in Illinois. So that's just one of the points that we may want to return to. What is our welfare policy? Mr. Ball's name came to my attention the first time when he co-authored a paper on welfare policy with Larry Summers that was presented at Davos a few months ago, the meeting of the world's masters of the universe at Davos, Switzerland. And I suppose we'll be hearing more from him, a good deal more, if Labour Party makes it back into the government in England. A couple of other minor points, well, not so minor. Everyone knows about the Baltimore riots and arson that's been going on. And can we really change policies? Will this motivate us to make any substantial changes? Or are we heading for another long, hot summers, as it's called, in the cities across the USA? more riots, more arson, because we're unable to deal with this welfare question. And the concentration of wealth will continue as if nothing has happened, because we have so much firepower we can keep down and suppress these expressions of discontent. The final note, in Israel, there's a UN report now accusing Israel of attacking the United Nations schools, where a number of people during the 50-day war of last summer tried to take shelter, and some 40 to 50 of them were killed. And the Israeli Hezbollah operations are saying, well, that there were some terrorists there, and so were justified, or they were being used for weapons storage or something, so we're completely justified in killing them. So another bad week, not so funny, and not really as merry here as it is apparently in merry old England on Ed Ball's Day. That's all.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching Aware on the Air, and we're celebrating various things. However, ironically, we'll go to Karen Aram and pivot to Asia.
Okay, this is in, excuse me, in relation to last week when I was discussing with a certain sense of euphoria, the Silk Railroad that is going through from China, Kunming, up in Xinjiang province, all the way through, as we know, through Eurasia, through to Dusseldorf, Germany, but also down through Thailand. They've got the contract with Thailand, and it's looking very good that they'll have the contract with Laos. And this is very important because it gives them an opening to the ports by train, but also it means that they can avoid the Malacca Straits, which is very critical to all shipping in that part of the world, in the Indian Ocean, and it may alleviate any potential war. That's what I'm looking at. And by that I say, if the U.S., with our containment of China, attempts to block the Malacca Straits at any point in time, that would block all the oil imports into China. And I think we know what that would result in. China is they're the major importer of oil and energy products. Yeah, other energy products as well. So that is very critical. And now just this week it was announced that China is investing $46 billion into a strategic Pakistan-China economic corridor. They're going to be building a silk rail from Xinjiang all the way through to, I think, Kashgar and Gwadar, and I'm not pronouncing that properly. But here again, this is 3 times the amount of money that the U.S. has been giving to Pakistan. And almost all of the money that the U.S. has been providing to Pakistan has gone towards weapons, as where what China's providing is industrial infrastructure projects. So this will help to alleviate poverty. And I make no mistake, I'm not in favor of all the privatization that will be taking place. I would rather see public ownership of the rails, et cetera, et cetera. And I know that it brings up issues. But at the same time, we have to look at the fact that China provides jobs. They come in with a checkbook and a pen. They don't supply bombs. They don't go in and bomb these nations. So I do see it as positive. Now, at the same time, we have to look carefully. China has been one of the largest suppliers of weapons to Pakistan. But most of the bombing, most of the destruction that's been taking place in Pakistan is all on the part of the U.S. So it is worth watching to see what happens, and hopefully it will avoid further conflict in the area. We can't be too sure. We know that India and Pakistan are nuclear, and one of the things that, from what I understand, that China is going to be supplying is what they call nuclear missile submarines to Pakistan. I'm like, okay. So there are different ways to look at this, but I see it as positive, just as Pepe Escobar sees it as positive, because we know what the U.S. is doing around the world, especially in Asia and with the destruction of the Middle East. And I'm taking that now one step further by saying that in Yemen, with all of the destruction that is taking place by Saudi and many of their allies, and of course us, and what our reason and purpose is other than just destroying another nation in the Middle East, but or is it just to show support to our ally Saudi? I'm not sure. But one of the things I know that's going to happen is that we're looking at supporting, evidently they're going to the Security Council and looking to apply an embargo on Yemen. And what's so really egregious about this is the fact that Yemen imports all food products, and you already have people starving right now because of the bombing and the destruction that's taking place. And we know what's happening to many of the migrants who are trying to, migrants, that's not the right word, just refugees who are trying to flee with the boats not making it and nobody wanting to take them into their nations. So we're looking at a really awful humanitarian crisis. And the only real winner from what some scholars are saying is that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, they're actually going to be the only winners out of all of this. So I think it's critical to understand. I don't understand the complexities of the war in Yemen, but it is complex. It's not that simple as it's being presented by the media, the corporate-owned media. But it is a really, really disastrous situation, and I think that we need to really cry out against this. Most Americans just see it as some kind of internal strife, and we have to do away with, regime change, which is always what the U.S. seems to be going for. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that because embargoes are like sanctions. They often do so much harm. And an embargo would be very disastrous for the people of Yemen, just as any embargo against China would put us in a very dangerous situation as well.
Thank you, Karen. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about what the U.S. is doing in making war around the world, that it manages remarkably well to hide from the American people. We are observing the 40th anniversary of the end of what the Vietnamese people call the American War, a war in Southeast Asia, not limited to Vietnam, that killed perhaps 4 million people in what is undoubtedly the greatest international crime since the Second World War. Americans think of it at all. They think of the Vietnamese War, the war in Vietnam, but the actual circumstances of the war were in fact extended well beyond Vietnam. And the U.S. purpose in the war was to forestall what the head of Amnesty International called several years ago the threat of a good example. The U.S. carried on its war in Southeast Asia under an immense propaganda barrage of stopping communism. What it was really stopping was the example of a peasant society that would develop its economy in a way not coordinated with the worldwide economy dominated by the United States and dominated by the American 1%. And when you understand that that's what the war was about, it's clear that in spite of not achieving its maximum war aims, the U.S. won that war. Vietnam today is thoroughly cowed and incorporated into the American economy, into the pivot to Asia, into the involvement with the American attempt to control not just the Asian economy, but the worldwide economy. The circumstances of the U.S., what the Pentagon calls offshore control of China, includes a domination of the economy of the region, and particularly, as Karen said, of energy flows within the region. Vietnam is thoroughly incorporated in that today. And for those of us who, when we were young, opposed this American crime, carried on by several American presidents, of course, it is a depressing at best situation. We have a special guest today, my old friend Timothy Kendall, who, when he was young and I was young, took a brave stand against this international crime and went to prison for it, and spent some time there as a result of his quite accurate observation that his country was involved in great criminal activity. Happy to have you here,
Thank
Tim.
you.
How does the celebrations of 40 years since the end of the war look to you?
Celebration. I'm
Yeah,
not sure if that's exactly the right word.
No,
but,
I'm not sure either.
I will just, I'm unaccustomed to participating in things like this, so I may fumble a bit, but I'll just say that...
Something we never do, of course.
Right. It's... at the time, when I refused to be drafted and went to prison, I think I had escaped from some of the naive optimism that a lot of my friends and associates and colleagues were still possessed of, namely that by doing something like that, we would have any lasting effect that would be visible in our lifetimes on the way society conducted itself when you come right down to it. And I should probably extend that to, from the most immediate local to the most widespread worldwide contexts. It isn't only in other countries around the world where we're waging war right here in the United States. Mm-hmm. You can't pick up a newspaper or read an online news source without seeing where today's police shooting is. And exactly. We have developed far beyond anything that we had back in the 1960s and early 70s. I'm not sure that "we" is entirely fair, but let's let that pass for the moment. But there's a national obsession with weapons and weaponry that is far beyond, I think, what it was then. We have very effective and extremely well-financed campaigns preaching the alleged benefits of everybody being armed all the time. And if, as the old proverb says, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, God help us all if all you have is a gun or a taser. And we're seeing almost every day the results of exactly that. This all, of course, does play into the economic aspects that have already been mentioned several times. But the way I, just for myself, have formulated this reality is that weapons have a mind of their own. People may flatter themselves that they possess arms or they have armaments when in actual point of fact, it's the other way around. We are still, how far back in history do you want to go? People will say, well, we're still living through the effects of the Second World War. Well, we're still living through the effects of the First World War and the Franco-Prussian War when you come right down to it. The reason for the two world wars can be said to be the enormous, completely out of control arms race that has been saddling the world since the Franco-Prussian War. There are people who have made the point that if it had not been for the assassination in Sarajevo, there would have had to be some other excuse for the First World War, which was the father of the Second World War, et cetera, because the arms race was so out of control that something was inevitably going to hit the release button. It happened to be the assassination in Sarajevo, which had nothing to do, with much of anything that was going on there. What had everything to do with it was this utterly out of control and completely insane arms race. Well, now we have this going on right here domestically. We have this big, enormous, well-heeled organization preaching that, well, everybody has to have guns and then we'll all be safe, won't we? Except for all the research that's ever been done. Yeah. I don't know. It is 40 years later. Whether we ought to be celebrating anything is another matter. Some of us were accused numerous times of having a kind of head in clouds, out of touch optimism, and we didn't just really understand the practicality of the political realities. When I would argue that in terms of practicality, what we're basically doing is continuing to look for solutions that we know are not under this particular street light because that's where all the light is, or we keep playing in a crooked poker game because it's the only game in town. Well, we need to think about other ways of doing that, starting with the individual, all the way up to the international population of the world. I don't see a lot of progress in that direction. It is one of the great sorrows of my life. I have 2 adult daughters now, and here 40 years later, we're handing them a worse world than the one we inherited. A worse world. I don't think it's quite dawned on them yet, though it inevitably will have to. Nor do I have any solutions to it. We have a monstrous lack of transparency where any kind of power is concerned. And that's why, we continually vote for whatever we, with the best efforts we can muster, conclude is the peace party or the peace candidate, and we continually get the opposite, as Carl has pointed out so eloquently. We do what we can. It's obviously not enough. What else are we going to do? And I wish I had an answer to that one. I had to settle 40-odd years ago for just not personally contributing to making it any worse, if I could avoid it. Maybe I didn't personally contribute to it. I don't have much of a sense of having done much to stop it or to turn it around. I wish that had been true. All I've been able to do since then, where I live, there aren't, I don't live in a university community, and so there aren't a lot of the organizations and so on that I used to belong to back when I was in school, both in undergraduate school and graduate school later. So you just sort of do it a person at a time. You talk about alternate ways of looking at things and point out from time to time that, well, just because we may not be willing to take up the gun and engage in fighting doesn't necessarily mean that we're naive. We know perfectly well that we could be risking our lives as well as anybody on a battlefield risks their lives. It may very well come to that. I mean, there are people who at least talk like they would just as soon shoot you as look at you if you so much as raise the question. And the more they talk about it, the more insistent it gets. And at some point, the pressure builds until it pops. But what does happen between the campaign and the administration, or between the political platform and when somebody actually gets their hands on power? And I certainly don't know. Something obviously does. It's hard for me to imagine that political candidates are crafty enough to pull it off, knowing the whole time that they're lying.
Completely cynically.
I think something happens between when the campaign starts and when they get halfway into an administration or a Congress or something. Something is happening there. We're not privy to what it is. It obviously has to do with what people refer to as the 1%. It's more like the 0.0001%. And you know, that used to be a radical sort of hippie thing to say, but now you're reading this in Forbes. Is that
Exactly.
mainstream enough? You're hearing it from Credit Suisse.
Yep.
Right.
Is that enough? What are they? Their most recent statistic is that 80 people own half the wealth of the world, in the world. So, yeah, you could suspect that there's something going on that we don't know about. Again, I as a little nobody, I wish I had some kind of answer or some way to find out, but I don't.
Tim, I admired what you did all those years ago and ever since, and I will add your careful political work in years since. I mean, you have exemplified what needed to be done then and now. And you put me in mind of a remark that the late Abby Hoffman made now 25 years ago, but reflecting on about the 15th anniversary of the end of the American War. He said, "We were young, we were reckless, arrogant, silly, headstrong, and we were right. I regret nothing." That seems to me to be quite right.
Yes. Actually, quite a long time before that, I had a occasion to make a similar remark in the. This is almost going to sound like bragging, but I was invited to a panel discussion when Gerald Ford was proposing what he was referring to as an amnesty, which of course was just loaded. It had strings attached all over it, and so it was anything but an amnesty, really. But yeah, the central feature of it was that he would be willing to grant amnesty to any draft violators who publicly admitted that they were wrong and repented of their misled ways. And I just said to this panel that, you know, that there's only one problem with that. They weren't wrong, they were right.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's just, I hadn't heard the Abby Hoffman quote, but I guess I'm in good company.
Thank you very much indeed. Comments?
Well, yes, it's very discouraging to see how little impact groups like this and individuals like ours seem to have on public perceptions and political action. But it seems to me there are a couple of considerations here. You have to start from where you are, do what you can, and realize that you never know what the actual consequences of your actions may be. There's a sense in which nobody knows what they're doing because what you're doing has many consequences in space and time and so on that are maybe so remote that there's really no way you can know about them. But do it anyway, because there's always that possibility that someone will listen. It will occur to them 10, 20, 30 years later that you were right, and it will help set them straight too.
I think the government is worried about that, actually. There's quite a campaign coming primarily from the Pentagon, but also from other parts of the federal government to condition and form the way in which Vietnam is remembered as these anniversaries come up. They're working hard on it. There are impressive groups in this country, like Veterans for Peace down in St. Louis, who are calling the government out on that, and are planning various activities to counter the government's attempt to whitewash what the Vietnam War was about.
Yeah, they're trying to rewrite it. There have been some interesting documentaries turning up on PBS, and you can see the Pentagon view there to some extent, but also people who are looking back at the draft resistors and the refuseniks and saying, why couldn't they save us from this terrible outcome in Vietnam? And of course, as you say, one of the ironies of history, the owl of Minerva flies only at dusk, Hegel said. We began to realize much later that it was all a terrible, destructive mistake, but the cunning of history has put Vietnam right back in the American orbit anyway.
Yes.
And thousands hundreds of thousands of deaths could have been avoided by simply acquiescing in what was going on in Vietnam at the time. But they didn't see it that way. We had to fight communism. And we had this Sherwin-Williams view of the world, you know, the paint, the red paint flowing down over all the globe and so on, and the domino theory and so on. And it was just all so crazy, but that's what happened.
And as I say, today it seems to me that the biggest problem in a way is the extent to which the present government, the present U.S. government, the present U.S. administration is worried enough about what conclusions Americans will draw from this history that they're busily trying to shoot the alma Minerva out of the air. The understanding implied by that image of what our actual history is feared by our leaders, and properly so. Tim started with the notion about our obsession with weapons and arms in this country, and the remark has been made that the first thing to say about American political culture is that it's remarkably fearful political culture. The U.S. has, not just in this generation, not just now in fear of terrorism, but 4 generations, back through the Cold War and fear of communism and so forth, to the other fears of the great crimes that American society are responsible for, namely slavery and the extermination of the Native Americans. U.S. society has a good reason to be afraid that it will encounter retribution for its crimes. Thomas Jefferson, strange and conflicted figure in a lot of ways, wrote, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and His justice will not cease forever." That seems to me a proper reflection as we try to think about this history and its present political effect. The fearfulness that produces the obsession with weapons and so forth has a base in American crimes. And politically, one way or another, that has to be dealt with. The sky is dark with owls flying at dusk. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, regarding the arms discussion, that is really critical. And we see it both here with the militarization of police nationwide. We see it all over the world. And recently, I've seen 2 discussions, very simple discussions, but related to fear now, is that the drones, which we know how violent the drone killings are, being implemented by our White House, is that now they're going to be robot drones. This is already, I guess it's already been created, and that's what we're looking at. And that's even worse, because now we're going to have machines deciding who should be killed. So, I mean, it's really frightening. And you know, we have all these films that people go to see, these blockbuster films with monsters and aliens or worse, machines killing people. And I'm thinking, here we are, folks. It's a reality. It's on its way. Okay, even though the real monster is us,
what seems
our
to be
government.
coming are these automated drones
Right.
that you're talking about, robotized, and they will decide on the basis of their internal algorithms what or who they're going to fire their rockets at.
There you go. Perfect. Exactly.
Oh, and I just spent 33 years in the software business. I can tell you there's never an internal mistake.
That doesn't happen.
Right.
No, it's everything is perfect.
Yeah.
There's no opportunity for human error.
Right.
Not much.
I want to make a comment on Vietnam, is that having been involved in the anti-war movement in the 70s, wish I'd been involved earlier, but and then living in Thailand in 1993, on behalf of U.S. Democrats abroad in Thailand, I organized at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand, a panel of primarily businessmen, most U.S., some Australian, in order to drop the embargo that the U.S. had, I think it was 93, that we had against Vietnam in order to start doing business. Of course, that was all I had to work with, were the businessmen, but my goal was to just drop the embargo with Vietnam. Needless to say, I find it really, really depressing today that Vietnam is now very close completely allied with the U.S. government in the containment of China. However, that's something China is working on, and I think that it would be beneficial. You know, there's still a lot of hard feelings there, but I think it would certainly be beneficial. China wants to use Laos as their sort of their go-between or a conduit to doing a new railroad throughout Vietnam as well as Cambodia. I mean, there are a lot of issues involved here from both the past and the present, with the fact that China supports a lot of the hydroelectric dams that are being constructed that are going to have negative impacts on the environment and the fishing industries of both Cambodia and Vietnam. But it would still be worthwhile to see a friendship develop. And Globe Trekker recently has done a film or a documentary on the railroad in Vietnam. They still have the same old railroad that we bombed so many times, and they would just get out there, I guess, like a hammer and a screwdriver in the typical Asian way of the time and repair it. And when you see this train, that's why I enjoyed it, because I once was signing up to take that trip from Hanoi to Hue. And one of my Vietnamese friends sort of talked me out of it. She said, Karen, you know, she said they have cages on the windows, and it's really, really a rough journey and whatnot. And so they show that. So it's still the same outdated train that they used, but it was critical at the time to get weapons from the north to the south. And that's why we just kept bombing it. But my point is that I'm hoping that Vietnam will see the writing on the wall and go with the people who, okay, 1979, China invaded them. They've been invading them for many, many years, but nothing as far as the kind of destruction and the bombing that were committed by the U.S. And I just can't imagine how many of the older people can stomach dealing with us, to be quite frank. So we'll see what happens on that score. And yeah, it's very disparaging today, especially for someone who you've given up much of your life. Let's put it that way. I don't know how many years, but you know, you really sacrificed yourself on the anti-war effort in Vietnam, and seeing what we're seeing now. Now, one of the comments, what I want to make towards what Ron was talking about, what's happening in Baltimore and what's been happening across the nation. We have Ferguson, we have Baltimore, is what the a Black Agenda report was reporting on the criticisms of Cornel West by, is it Michael Dyson?
Dyson, yes.
Yeah, and the article really deals with how, you know, these people like Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, all of these leaders, how they are really puppets of, I was going to say of the current regime, of the current U.S. regime, but that basically is what it is. And how there are enough black leaders rising up now that see the truth, they know the truth. And this is, to me, the hope that Black Lives Matter movement, what we need to see them do is unite across the nation, these various different movements. And hopefully, that's one of the reasons here we set up a local Green Party, Prairie Greens, or we revived the Prairie Greens, and why I see it as, Chris Hedges has talked about this, we need a party that represents us, at least when we go to vote, represents our goals, our ideals. At the same time, we're going to need mass movements. They are critical to bringing about any change. We know the government has militarized and they're prepared. That's what all of this militarization of the police is about. And this morning I received a CNN breaking news comment that they were sending 5,000, they were trying to gather 5,000 law enforcement people to go into Baltimore to keep the peace.
Yeah, it's they've activated the National Guard.
Right, right. And I'm thinking to myself, you would think we were at war. Well, we are. We are people. And there is enough dissatisfaction amongst these communities and the forced austerity and poverty upon them and shooting people. And it's taking place with mostly young blacks today. But as Kevin, the author of Killing Trayvons, wrote, and I can't remember his last name again, Carl, they're killing white people too. It's not just black people, but they're focusing on the poor. This is an economic war that we're talking about. So people had better recognize that.
And that, lest there be any doubt, is what I was referring to when I said, you know, something happens between the beginning of the campaign and halfway through the administration or halfway through the Congress. who is, as the old puppet on television used to say, who's waking your head?
Yeah.
Who is working this? Who's pulling the strings? Well, you can get a hint from Forbes or Credit Suisse.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they're not very many, but they appear to be running just about everything. Mm-hmm. And it's, it's extremely well concealed to the point where just sitting here, I don't know. So
I see a lot of blogs and comments on Facebook mentioning these various different groups. So there are a lot of conspiracy theories out there about the Bilderberg group and I don't know, the Rockefeller group. I don't know. I don't get involved in that. But you know that there are these people that are supporting our government and that our government is listening to. And that's where we're going. So I guess they're part of the 1%.
I think it may actually be the other way around. The government is supporting them.
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
They support our government, and then our government supports them. Exactly. It's the money. Yeah.
I think, in fact, the proliferation of conspiracy theories, the notion that everyone from the Illuminati to the Rockefeller family is behind this, and that's the reason there are problems in the world, because that itself is a symptom, is a datum. The fact that so many conspiracy theories arise is a testimony to the attempt of our leaders to mystify what they're doing,
I think
to
so.
cover over what the 1% or the 0.001% is. In other words, what the economic and political structure of the society actually is. To give an honest account of the economic and political structure of the society is to produce a serious criticism of the plutocracy, as it's been called. Plutocracy means rule by money. Pluto, believe it or not, means money. So plutocracy is the structure that is attempting to hide itself, in a sense. Now, it's easy to, that seems in some sense so surprising. It's easier for people sometimes to say, an enemy hath done this. There's a little group of evil men out there someplace, and all we have to do is find them, put them up against the wall, and then everything will be fine.
Right.
Well, it's been tried in various ways. Tim says, and I think accurately, since the Franco-Prussian War, we've been finding groups who we're going to put against the wall because they're doing it to us, and somehow it hasn't worked. Somehow we're talking about what we would today call systemic or structural reasons, not for these, what are indeed vast crimes, rather than the actions of a particular group of criminals. And that's an important distinction. It seems to me that, as Thomas Pynchon says, if you can get them asking the wrong questions, you don't have to worry about answers.
Right.
And that's where, roughly, where our, where our leaders are right now.
There's an interesting book I return to from time to time by a journalist named Neward called The Eliminationists. The fundamental logic of the American approach to all these problems is that they are caused by evil people. Our problem is to identify those people and to eliminate them.
Right.
And then we'll solve the problem that way. And that is so wrong. But
because
the way
the
people
assumption
think.
there's something wrong with the structure is unthinkable.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Or,
The system,
or to
it's
change,
called.
if we change the system, everybody starts to get frightened because, well, if we change the system, what are we going to have? Socialism, communism. Yeah.
It may be beyond even the
knows?
structure. It may be, there may be something even more fundamental going on there, and that is related to recent research you may have seen about the inverse relationship between economic level and the level of empathy one has for one's fellow human beings. And when you multiply that to the level of 80 people owning half the wealth of the world, you've got to conclude that it's not just a lack of empathy, it's out and out hostility at that point. And that can create the kind of systemic dysfunction that we're just talking about.
But of those two factors, Tim, which is cause and which is effect? Ron recently has been talking up the work of the late Carl Polanyi, who tried to give an account of how you produced a society in which empathy could be, as it were, excluded. And that the economic structure of that society had shockingly deleterious effects on the notions of society that its members had. You know, this is what's going on, and therefore you end up with a conspiracy theory or something like that, because you don't recognize that it is perhaps is precisely that that market society that you've constructed, capitalism for lack of a better name, neoliberalism in the current term, that's producing those psychological quirks that you're complaining about.
Yeah. Well, how do people justify to themselves what they're doing? With the rise of capitalism, it had to be that they were doing the work of God and in acquiring wealth. And then the question was how to use it wisely. What was it that Andrew Carnegie said, that the very wealthy were God's custodians of the world's wealth?
What he ought to know.
And look whose name led all the rest. Yes,
right, right. But how do people justify it to themselves? There are a few among the 1%, shall we say, who turn against it eventually. You see the emptiness of that.
Yes.
It's utter hostility to every known religion, for example, and they have to adopt, as a matter of self-justification, something like the Ayn Rand view, that this is realism, it's objectivity, and I must say, I don't think that there's a transformation of character that takes place between the time a person starts to seek public office and the time when they are inaugurated into that office.
They're corrupt from the beginning.
Well, yeah. Where's the beginning of all of this? Some have characterized this and ridiculed it really as going all the way back to Adam and Eve and blaming it all on the snake who started all this. And that's utterly futile, it seems to me. But
Yeah, we'll never pin the snake down.
right.
An interesting example of that your comment reminds me of, Ron, back to the question of what's going on in, pardon me, in Baltimore right now. Baltimore is under curfew, the National Guard is in the streets, and the professional baseball game scheduled for Camden Yards in Baltimore was canceled last night because of the, quote, disorders, close quote, in Baltimore. The owner of the baseball team made a remarkable comment. John Angelos, the chief operating officer of the Baltimore Orioles, wrote a remark about why the Baltimore Orioles aren't playing tonight. He wrote, "My greater source of personal concern, outrage, and sympathy beyond this particular case is focused neither upon one night's property damage nor upon the acts of a group, but is focused rather upon the past 4-decade period during which an American political elite has shipped middle-class and working-class jobs away from Baltimore and cities and towns around the U.S. to third-world dictatorships like China and others." I want to talk about that. "Plunged tens of millions of good, hardworking Americans into economic devastation, and then followed that action around the nation by diminishing every American's civil rights protections in order to control an unfairly impoverished population living under civil rights protections, living under an ever-declining standard of living, and suffering at the butt end of an ever more militarized and aggressive surveillance state. The innocent working families of all backgrounds whose lives and dreams have been cut short by excessive violence, surveillance, and other abuses of the Bill of Rights by government pay the true price, an ultimate price, and one that far exceeds the importance of any kid's game played tonight or ever at Camden Yards. We need to keep in mind people are suffering and dying around the U.S., and while we're thankful no one was injured at Camden Yards, there's a far bigger picture of poor Americans in Baltimore and everywhere who don't have jobs and are losing economic, civil, and legal rights. And this makes inconvenience at a ball game irrelevant in light of the needless suffering government is inflicting upon ordinary Americans. That's John Angelos, the Chief Operating Officer of the Baltimore Orioles, clearly a member of the 1%. The team was bought by his father, I think. And but the comment is unfortunately terribly accurate. You're listening to, you're watching Aware on the Air. We have a few minutes left, and Michael Bai has joined us. Michael, you have something you want to get in before we have to go?
Yeah, I don't know how much we talked about the Ukraine conflict today.
Haven't mentioned it.
Haven't mentioned it. Maybe some updates and about the German stance on it, and about former Chancellor's Gerhard Schröder's position about the conflict. So
you've got about 2 minutes.
We have about 2 minutes
left. Get that into 2 or 3 minutes, that would be great.
Excellent. Gerhard Schröder said last week that, of course, what happened on the Crimea is a a violation of the international people's law, but also he mentions that that the West formally sent airplanes to Serbia, to Yugoslavia, and was bombing a sovereign state is representing a similar action that what Putin took. So we accusing Putin should probably also look at ourselves and our former actions before we take those turns. Yeah, that's just what I have to report in the 2 minutes.
Oh, well, you gotta take another minute. This is important. This is important, and you're absolutely right. It's not being talked about in the American media. So.
At the same time, Germany is, some Germans are experiencing an identity crisis, while some support the West, others have former relations to Russia, and there's a split in opinions on whether military intervention, sanctions are to be supported, or whether Putin's actions are justifiable. So, yeah, that's something that Germany has to resolve, and
Americans should know about it, which they don't. Right? Yes. You've been watching, thank you, Michael. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 18th week of 2015. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett. Thanks to him, also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see the Facebook page for Aware for articles referred to by the panel. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and the others, who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Szoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Livy, Karen Aram, Michael Bai, David Johnson, David Green, and our special guest tonight, Timothy Kendall, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.